Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about a very, very special set that was actually loaned to me by a very special guy named Bucky. He is special because he retired from buying new IMs about a year ago, and I would love to say that he came out of retirement just to purchase this very, very special set, but not exactly true. Those of you who know him will know that he purchases sets all the time, and yet he is still retired from purchasing IEMs. But we are very, very thankful that he actually picked this one up used, and this is the EJ07M in resin, a very rare bird indeed. It's everyone else who purchased the EJ07M pretty much has a metal version. That's what I have. That's what almost everyone has. You know, this is what they would call the reshelled version. So you can actually purchase the EJ07M in the metal and then tell them that you really want it in resin. And if you pay a little extra, they will reshell it into resin. That is exactly what this version is. So before we kind of dive into it, I will say that the metal version, when it came out, Michael Bruce, he is the all-knowing EJ07 person. Going back to the original EJ07, I don't really know anyone who had more versions of EJ07. And then we both purchased M when it came out. And probably within 2 weeks, he sort of knew exactly how this was going to play out. And he really predicted how this was going to play out at the time, probably a good year ago. So the short nozzle on the M, on that metal shell, has a shorter nozzle than this resin one. And that short metal nozzle causes you a little increase in pinna gain. And it almost looks like this on the graph. So if we look at the EJ07M stock, you can see that there's a little bump in the pinna gain. And I think in theory they raised the base. So the original EJ07 had kind of a reduced base shelf. So the M bumped up the base a little bit. The metal shell bumped up the pinna gain area, and it was sort of not necessarily threw it off balance, but the theory was at the time, and Michael was kind of dead on with it, that it was just causing a little more extra pinna gain. And one thing you can do was this blue line was actually called the filter version. So putting in an Olina damper on it would actually bring your pinna gain down 1 or 2 decibels, and you were kind of more in line with where it should be. But then when we look at the resin version, you can kind of see the base shelf is about the same, the mids, but the resin actually has this reduced pinna gain. And what Michael would say was that is probably exactly where the original intention was supposed to be. It should have been like that from the beginning. That is closer to what EJ07, the original, was. And it sounds much more natural and smooth, and it doesn't have this little bump right there in the pinna gain area. So, yeah, so Michael was totally dead on with that. And after he got this set, he had this set a few weeks ago, and he basically said, yeah, it fixed all the problems. So at that point, I sort of knew, even without hearing it, and then as soon as I got it, even without A-Bing it, I knew that I would probably hate this set because it actually makes my set sound not quite as good. This really just fixes a bunch of really tiny issues, but the overall, no one really wants to own a sort of a pricey set and then get something that's, this is just the slightly better version of the one that you have. It'll just cost you $180 and a new shell to get there. So, yeah, so even when Michael was describing, he's like, yeah, fix everything. You got to hear it. You got to hear it. Like, I don't want to hear it. I'm going to hate it. Just for that reason, because it makes mine sound a little less great. So in the interim, between hearing EJ07M, putting a filter on it, Michael had actually set out, and he retuned the M, and I think I'd actually talked about it at some point, but he sent me his M, and it was really exactly a step in the same direction that this one headed. But he dropped the mid bass a little bit and cleaned that up, and he reduced the pinna to smooth it out, and sort of exactly how this one sounds, but he did it by removing the grill and actually putting dampers on the individual bores. So it was a complicated way to do it because the M has an unfinished bore on it. Once you pull the grill off, it's sort of a mess of plastic there that was all jagged and not even, and it was sort of more difficult than it should be. But he was sort of dead on, with that retuning, and moving it towards exactly how he thought it was supposed to be. Then to hear it actually implemented in resin was actually super cool. So what does it sound like compared to mine? So I do think that my EJ07M is bassier than the other ones. And I knew that after hearing Michael's. And he pulled the mid bass back a little bit, and that's fine. But I knew mine was always sounded just a little more bassy, especially in the mid bass. And even hearing it compared to this, you can look at the graph and say that, there's effectively no difference there between these two versions. But to my ear, it actually sounds different. And I heard the same thing with Michael's version. So I knew that from Michael's set. I'm not too angry about that. I knew having a little bit more mid bass on my M is fine, but it does mask a little bit of the detail and a little harder to hear some of that upper treble air and detail out there. And as I said, the metal does seem to compensate a bit more bass for more pinna, right? So I think he was kind of dead on, and that's the way exactly it sounds, is my M sort of feels a little bit heavier here without the filter. It's definitely not shouty, but it sort of hits a bright spot right there, and it makes it a little harder to hear that out here. So if you kept that the same and just reduced this a little bit, this part isn't really a bright spot anymore. It's just this really nice smooth transition into the treble. Then you get to hear everything out here a little cleaner and clearer, and that's exactly what really happens on the resin version. So you sort of get the resin, get that less pinna, more natural, smoother. Doesn't sound like there was any really loss in detail or resolution. And I think the opposite really happened. It's just easier to hear everything out in the upper treble that way. And I think Michael, as I said, Michael would say that this is how it really was meant to be from all of his experience with the original 07. I think he's pretty much dead on with that thought. So from memory, I still think Michael's was actually cleaner in the treble just because he pulled the mid bass back a little bit more. But that was from memory, and I only had a quick loaner on that one. He didn't really boost anything. It was just easier to hear. Everything was just very clear compared to my version of M. And plus, my version of the M has a damper on the M on the nozzle. So my version sort of did bring back the stock, and it's that blue line. So I did get a little reduction in the pinna, and maybe it makes that sound a little bassier, which is probably true. But I sort of fixed one problem, created an artifact, and again, I think all these things are sorted out on the resin, and that's sort of why I hate it so much, because it sort of fixed everything in one shot, and it looks beautiful at the same time. So there you go. That's what I got on this set. And if you want to get one for yourself, I think you can order it that way if you contact them, or if you have one, you can actually reshell it as well. But in any case, you have to contact them at their website or Facebook or Discord or any of the other places they're at. So again, thank you, Bucky, for the loaner, and thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.